Hello storytellers, welcome to Bound by Words. My name is Madie. I am a freelance editor and a fantasy writer, and today we are talking about consistency in our writing. I've broken this topic up into two main sections: consistency in our writing process, the how and when and how often we write, sort of our writing habits, and consistency in our prose themselves. I think consistency is one of the biggest things that contributes to getting our novels finished, so it is definitely indispensable in this series on starting a new novel or starting a new work in progress. This is video 3 in the series. If you haven't seen the first 2, I will link them up above, but I'll also link the playlist at the end of this video because in the next video I'm going to be giving you guys 6 tips on how to finish your book, 6 things that you should be conscious of before you go in or while you're writing to help you get to the end of your manuscript. So if you are also a writer of novels, please consider subscribing. I post writing related content twice a week. And without further ado, we're going to jump right in. The first section I want to talk about is writing consistency in our writing habits and our writing processes. And then I have some tips at the end of, fun things to try to really keep that going. And then the second half of the video, we're going to be talking about writing consistency when it comes to prose and craft and the art of writing. They are both things that are incredibly important if you want to be a regularly published author, but I think there's also a lot of over generic, super scripted, and prescribed advice to how to do consistency in writing like the best way. And it's kind of hard to hear some of it because some of it just doesn't make sense or isn't plausible, and it sets sort of an unrealistic expectation, especially for new writers who aren't familiar with the expectations of writing. For example, some common advice that you will find a lot of places in the internet is that you should write every day. If you want to be a published writer, if you want to write like a business, if you want to be successful, you need to write every day. And while there are many writers who do have the ability and the desire to write every day, there are also a lot of writers, probably the large majority of writers, that just aren't able to make that kind of commitment because of work or families or holidays or events or honestly anything else, other hobbies, chores. There's so many things that can get in the way with writing. So I want to talk about in a realistic way that most writers can relate to and achieve what it's like to create writing consistency when it comes to your writing habit and your writing process. And there is some blanket statement advice that I think fits across the board for every single writer to have the perfect writing process. So the meat of this section, something that I want every person who watches this to take away from it, is that writing habits and writing consistently is more about creating a process or a series of goals that you can regularly achieve. It might push you sometimes, it might feel easy sometimes, but something you can regularly achieve without disrupting the rest of your quality of life. We want to write faster, of course, we want to get our books done, we want to write more, we want to publish more often, more frequently, but if your writing habits, even if they are extremely consistent, are set up in a way that you are stressing yourself out, it's going to create the risk of quitting entirely. Having goals that are too lofty or extreme, like writing every day or writing an hour at a time, 5 days a week, if that's not something that you can achieve, setting that goal for yourself, it's gonna do one of a few dangerous things. First, it might cause stress and anxiety that is either gonna keep you from producing your best work, or it's going to create a negative association with writing, or it's gonna keep you extremely exhausted, which might lead to burnout, which is something that's really hard to get out of, but also might lead you to quit your book. It might lead you to be discouraged that you're not meeting those really lofty goals that a lot of people on the internet agree are the best way to go about things, and the worst thing that you can do is be discouraged about your progress along the way. So every writer should be focusing on, in order to achieve consistency in writing routine, progress and not perfection. If your perfect writing schedule is writing 5 days a week for an hour a day, but right now you only really write 1 or 2 days if you have the time, then consistently writing 2 days for several weeks in a row will be progress, and you will see more words added to your manuscript, and you will start to feel more habitual in your writing habits. The reason it is important to create a balance where we have these writing goals and habits that are achievable and regular, and I'm going to use the term regular most often when I talk about writing goals, because it is more important that you are setting goals and meeting goals for yourself that are regular and repetitive to create a habit than it is to write every day or to achieve your end goal. You will see a greater benefit from creating creating a regular writing habit, emphasis on the word regular, not every day, not always the same, but frequent and repetitive, you will see a bigger increase in what you add to your manuscript and how quickly those words sort of stack up and really build your book by doing it in a way that is realistic. You know, your downtime is not the same as your availability, and it is important to have downtime to relax and unwind. And if you're only free a few hours a week, spread out throughout the week, then that doesn't mean that you have a few hours to write. You know, you might only have half an hour to write or an hour to write throughout the whole week, and it is better to create that consistent habit than it is to force yourself to write more often and lead to one of those things like the anxiety or the burnout or the stress. And the reason why is because when we create a consistent writing process, we are not only creating the habit of sitting down and writing words, we are also increasing our writing stamina. And I have a really old video on writing stamina, but we are increasing our ability to sit and write a certain amount at a time. You might only be able to write a couple hundred words now. You might have never sat down and written at one time more than 1,000 words. That might be your stamina max, but when you create these regular writing habits, you're exercising that muscle and that part of your brain that allows you to do that. So it is more than just creating the perfect schedule and sitting down and making yourself do it. On top of building the stamina, you're also teaching your brain how to actively create things on command, which is really hard. I think it's something that a lot of writers might struggle with because we have these episodes of creativity and brainstorming where we have so many ideas and we are inspired and we know how our book wants to sound, but then because we are human and, you know, moods change and attitudes change, we'll also have a lot of instances where we might not be in the mood to write. And when that happens, it's going to be a lot harder to put the words down. They might not be as high of a quality, and it might just be harder to hit a specific word count. So we are not just creating a schedule that we're going to force ourselves to stick to, but we are also exercising our writing stamina, and we are also teaching our brain how to create on command. Without incorporating those two very important components into your writing habits, it's going to be almost impossible to create consistency both in your habit and also in the quality of your prose, which we're going to be talking about in a minute. But before we move on to quality of prose, some tips for creating a consistent and regular writing routine. The first thing I would recommend is experiment. Experiment with how you write, you know, whether it's by hand or on the computer, whether it's a specific software you use, whatever it is. Experiment with, you know, are you writing in the morning or at night? Maybe do some experiments like, this is what I seen somebody do on YouTube, this is what I seen somebody do in their blog that they talked about, here's a famous writer that I admire, this is how they draft their book. Experiment in any way that you can think when it comes to writing. Make it a game, make it fun, and the reason I suggest that is because you're going to find things that work really well for you, and then you're going to find things that don't, and weeding out the things that don't work for you and recognizing those and being okay with dismissing them will help you create a more consistent habit because it'll give you a more comfortable and a more enjoyable time writing. Another thing that will lead to a consistent writing habit is a designated writing space. And I say this a bit hesitantly because I don't believe there is like a rule that you have to write in the same space or on the same device or at the same table or desk or building, but I do know that there are a lot of people who benefit from, especially at the beginning of a habit, creating that like cut and dry sort of consistency. Like I sit at my desk every night for half an hour before bed, and then eventually when I get used to that, you know, then I might be able to write wherever I want for half an hour before bed. Sometimes it's just breaking a habit you have before. Like I have a bad habit of getting too comfortable, like just sitting in my living room before I go to bed, and then it's like my brain shuts off and I don't want to do anything. So if I want to stay productive, I have to break that subconscious habit I already have by removing myself from that area. So being more aware of those things and also just experimenting with where you write will help tremendously with your comfort. The next tip sort of has 3 steps, but set goals for yourself. Push yourself to achieve them and give yourself grace when you don't. And the reason I sort of lump those together is because you want these goals to be things that you know that you plausibly could achieve, and the reason that step 2 is make yourself achieve them is because sometimes you're not going to feel like it even if it's totally within your means. If you have the free time, if you didn't do anything all day, you're going to have slow mental days, and this is the part where we teach our brains to create on command. The giving yourself grace is just being able to alter your goals if maybe you accidentally make a goal that is either way too easy or way too hard. My last tip for creating consistency in a writing process is to track your progress. Whether you're using a planner or a SMART goal system where you actually are writing down your goals so that you can see them and look back at them, I think one of the best things that you can do for your writing career in general is tracking your progress, even if it's just putting the date at the top of every document you write and starting a new document every time, even if it's just, throwing little tags in throughout your manuscript and saying on this day I got this many words, because it'll allow you to look back and tweak your goals so that you can create the ideal writing routine and process and expectation, which is a schedule that has you constantly working on your novel. The reason this is so important is because it'll allow you to track when you are consistent, and when you aren't, it'll allow you to sort of evaluate why and if it's important that you weren't consistent then. For example, if you are very consistent over the span of 2 months and you have just like 1 to 3 weeks where you were under the weather and you weren't consistent then, that of course makes sense and you should give yourself grace then. But if you don't track that information as you go and you don't record when you write or how often you write or the progress you make, then you risk sort of looking back and saying, I don't think I did enough, and not really having anything to help like reassure yourself that, you're making progress even if you haven't hit perfection yet. The next thing we're going to be talking about today is consistency in writing in the prose themselves. Most of us call this author voice. So your author voice is like your personal, distinguishable, like way of writing prose and way of telling a story that is different from every other writer. It's one of the things that makes retellings of stories so amazing and interesting. So nailing your perfect author voice, if you haven't yet, if you're a new writer, it might be something that takes a lot of trial and error and experimentation. So don't be discouraged if you feel like you just haven't found your author's voice yet. One of the most important things, and this is why we talked about this first in the video, one of the most important things when it comes to creating a consistent tone of voice or a consistent feel to your writing, the prose themselves, is having a consistent writing routine. If you spend 6 to 8 hours one day really just doing nothing but writing, getting so much progress done in your manuscript, and then you're busy for a month and a half or 2 months and you don't add anything to it, whenever you come back and add words again, it's reasonable and realistic that your prose might not match up perfectly, or they might not sound the same or have the same tone, because you might be in a totally different mood or have a different plan or idea or inspiration behind why you want to write that day. So creating a consistent writing habit, one that isn't going to stress you out too much so that you can continue to do it regularly, will help you produce words regularly and minimize the dissonance that you'll get from taking long breaks in the middle of a manuscript. Of course, if you're writing your first draft, it will likely feel a little bit inconsistent anyway, because consistency is making everything match. And if you're doing your first book in a series or a new world or something like that, then you don't have anything to match the new parts to, because you are creating the baseline. So the idea of creating consistency in your writing when it comes to a first draft is more how can we limit the amount of really extreme differences we're going to have when it comes to the quality of prose. So if you have a bad writing habit and you have days where you're extremely stressed out, exhausted, not invested, and you just want to get it over with, you're not going to have as good quality of writing those days. You're not going to feel as connected and you're not going to be able to write as comfortably. Then that might affect how consistent your prose are. 3 tips for creating consistent prose and writing on the first go of writing a manuscript. The first one is using a style sheet. If you're not familiar with what a style sheet is, it's a document that a lot of editors use, especially in the copy editing stage of manuscripts, but I think it can be really beneficial to start it as soon as possible, even with the first draft, if it's something that you're willing to prepare for your manuscript. If not, editors definitely just compile this on the final read. But when it comes to consistency, this is a list of people's names when they pop up. You might include character descriptions if you have special terms for magical places or artifacts, or words that you create or use that is a context that might be slightly different. Any little nuance words in your manuscript. I would always recommend keeping a running tally of those, so you might not want to create an entire style sheet when it comes to all of the editorial decisions you're making in your manuscript, because you might not have any of those decisions yet. But it's always good to start with the foundation of a style sheet, which is basically this is how I spell all of the characters' names, these are all of the important places. And I think it's good to have that all in one place, because not only do you have a reference for as you're writing in case you need to reference a character you haven't referenced in a while, you can see how their name is spelled, but also you'll be able to look at the names next to each other and make sure that none of them are too similar. You can even give that style sheet to somebody else for review and make sure that they're comfortable reading and pronouncing all of the names you used in your novel. That's something I definitely recommend for fiction or fantasy. The next tip for creating consistency in your first draft is to read before you write. Read what you had written last, read your synopsis, read your goals, read something that you have created for your book before you start writing every session. If you read the last 3 paragraphs of what you wrote and where you left off, it'll put you back in the mindset of, you know, where are the characters right now, what are they doing? It'll also like put you back into the tone of voice that you chose for your novel or that you were writing in previously. For me personally as a writer, this also just helps me be in the mood to add words to my manuscript. It gives me more of like a connection to what I already have there, but I think it also does just really help when it comes to consistency, because then you sort of have the types of phrasing and word choice and, you know, syntax that you were using previously in your brain as you continue to add words to your manuscript. Now, those are things that you might want to change throughout your manuscript, so you might want to play around, like reread that section and say, okay, how can I do that differently? How can I do that better? Or you might reread it and say, wow, I wrote that yesterday and I thought that it read really smooth then, but it definitely does not now, and it'll give you the opportunity to fix or change something to create a consistency. The last tip is to be ready to review and refine. Just like when people refine gold, you know, you heat it up and all of the impurities come to the surface and they scrape them off. And then you let it cool down and you heat it up again. That process we do with our novels. You want to chisel out sort of the best version of your novel in that draft one, but you have to be ready and able to recognize that there are going to be things that are wrong with it. You're definitely going to have things that you're going to need to change. You're going to have things that didn't read as well whenever you're reviewing them as they felt when you wrote them, and you have to be okay and prepared to remove those things to create consistency in your writing. So if you are rereading through things, or if you're marking tabs, you're keeping track, if you have things during the drafting process that you already know need changed, then you can always mark those or make notes to yourself so that you don't have to stop drafting if you don't want to, but then you're able to write to the sense of consistency you want after you remove the errors. If you start your book off and you realize, you know, a couple chapters in that the meat of what you wrote is something that you want to keep, but like the tone or the way the characters speak to each other or the relationship they have is something that needs to change or be altered, continue to write from that point on for what you want your manuscript to look like whenever you are done with draft 1, because if you continue to write based on what you have just to create a sense of consistency, then you're probably going to have a larger amount of inconsistency in the final draft. Something that might help with this is keeping like a synopsis of what you want your book to read, or I've seen people like write down adjectives, how they want their book or characters to come across. You know, if you have a character sheet and you just write like 3 adjectives that you think describe that character's mood, even something as small as that can help you create consistency in drafting your new project. So with that, if you got anything from this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and please consider subscribing while you're down there, because next time we are talking about 6 things that you can do to help you finish your manuscript. One of the most important things, I think it's where a lot of people struggle. I feel like the statistic is pretty high, don't quote me on the numbers, but it's something like 80% of people, somewhere around that start books don't finish them. So beat the statistic, watch the next video, and finish your first draft.